Hey everybody, Bill here. Let's talk about the frame rate on the Steam Deck. There's something that I want to make sure that everybody understands before I really get into it. And that's that I have always been somebody who has said that the resolution is not anywhere near as important as the frame rate. In fact, I've got another podcast where I talk about games that people love. It's called 143 Pixels. And at the end of every single episode, myself or my guests say the resolution doesn't matter. Now, I know that I'm talking to a lot of people who are very, very heavily into the PC market. And so for them, the resolution does matter. And that's why I feel like a lot of people get confused, or not necessarily confused, but they get the wrong idea about what happens when we talk about targeting 30 frames per second. And here's why. I've seen a billion posts on Twitter, on Reddit, on the comment section in my other Steam Deck videos where people are saying this thing is doomed. There's no way it can do what Valve is saying it can do. And I think that a lot of those people are assuming, well, not assuming, they're coming from a place where they're used to games running at 1080p or 1440 or 4K. And I'll admit it, I play most of my games in 4K, but the Steam Deck isn't a 4K machine. I mean, technically, if you plug it into a dock and then you plug that dock either into a computer monitor or your TV, it can output 4K, but it's not designed for that. It's designed around that 7-inch LCD screen that has a resolution of 1280 by 800. And because of that, people often make the wrong assumptions. So let's talk about the frame rate on the Steam Deck and how, in this case, the resolution absolutely matters. All right, let's start by talking about what does 720p mean. And I know a lot of you already know this, and if I get something wrong here, please feel free to let me know in the comments down below. Speaking of comments, I made a video all about how the trackpads on the Steam Deck could be used in order to play games on the Steam Deck that otherwise were not designed with controller inputs in mind. You can check out that video in the description down below. Now, Randy B left a comment on that video, and I'm going to address that comment, but not in this video. So if you haven't already subscribed and turned on notifications and you want to find out my answer to this comment right here, make sure that you do those things. That way you get notified when I post that video. I think I have a solution on how Valve can get developers to make it so I don't have to do all that work. All right, let's keep going. 720p is the vertical height measurement in pixels that you're looking at when you're talking about a computer monitor. Generally, 1280 by 720 is what we go for. Now, the Steam Deck is 1280 by 800. I'm not sure if they're going to be rendering games in 800p or in 720p. We've kind of heard both things from the IGN interviews from Valve employees. So we're not 100% sure, because I've heard them say 720p a couple times, and then I've also heard them say 800p. So, you know, time will tell. We'll find out soon enough. Let's assume that they're talking about 720p. 720p, which is 1280 by 720. That's 1280 this way by 720 this way. That works out to be around 920,000 pixels. Okay, so a pixel is a little square that's on the screen, and you're rendering the computer is rendering 920,000 of those at any moment. Okay, roughly. I'm giving you rough numbers here. Now let's compare that to 1080p. All right, 1080p is a vertical resolution of 1080 and a wide resolution of 1920. Generally, I think, and maybe I'm wrong, but I think a majority of the people out there who have TVs and computer monitors are looking at a 1080p screen. The days of people looking at a 720p screen are long behind us, and the days of people looking at 1440p or 4K screens are in front of us. And yeah, there's definitely people who are looking at those, but those are the outliers. And the thing that you have to remember is people who are watching this video, people who are extremely excited about what the Steam Deck is, people who know about this stuff now, well before it comes out and don't just see one in a store at some point. Those people, they tend to be on the bleeding edge. And oftentimes the people on the bleeding edge tend to forget that they are on the bleeding edge. They assume that everybody thinks the same way that they do. And so they want to know, they assume that everybody behaves the same way that they do. And because of that, they often, I don't know, how do I want to say this? They often ignore or downplay ideas that don't necessarily apply to them. And that's where a lot of the comments that I've seen are coming from, I think. Now let's get back to the straight numbers of 1080p. All right, like I said before, 1920 by 1080. What is that distance? Well, that's multiplied. That's 2 million pixels roughly, about 2.1 million pixels roughly. That's a lot more pixels. That's double the pixels of 720p. So when you're playing a game, and look, I did a New World stream the other day, and I had to lower my resolution because my computer could not handle playing the game and rendering the stream at the same time. So I had to lower my resolution in order to make the game perform better. And that's what a lot of people end up doing. If you look at the difference between 1080p and 720p, that's double the pixels. That means that your graphics card, and I'm simplifying here, okay, has to work essentially twice as hard in order to make a 1080p screen at the same frame rate that you're playing on 720p. Let's move on to 4K. 4K is 3840 by 2160. So 3840 this way by 2160 this way. And if you multiply those together, you get 8.2 million pixels. Now, that's what I usually am gaming at, is 4K, either on my home PC or on Google Stadia or on my Xbox Series X over here. I'm usually gaming on a 4K screen. And because of that, I need hardware that pushes really, really hard in order to accomplish that task, because that's 8 times, almost 9 times, the number of pixels that you see on a 720p display. So when people look at the Steam Deck and they look at its specs and they say, well, there's no way it can handle the newer games, I think a lot of them are dismissing the fact of how important resolution is, which is weird for me to say, as I just told you, like the tagline of one of my podcasts, 143 pixels, is the resolution doesn't matter. Well, the resolution does matter when it comes to frame rate. So if you want to get a good frame rate, you generally will lower your resolution. Now, a lot of hardware manufacturers and game publishers and developers, they'll do this thing called dynamic resolution, where your resolution will be, and I'm just going to throw numbers out here. These are not hard numbers. 4K at one moment, 1080p at another moment, 720p at another moment, depending on how much stuff is on the screen, in order to maintain that smooth frame rate of either 30 or 60 frames per second. So the next question has to be, does the Steam Deck support dynamic resolution? At this point, I'm not sure. I've done a little bit of research, and to be fair, my knowledge of computer hardware and the architectures that they support is fairly limited. So if you know the answer and can give actual proof to back it up, leave a comment down below. I'm not sure if the Steam Deck supports dynamic resolution. However, I'm going to assume that it can, depending on the game, because we've got something like the Nintendo Switch, which can support dynamic resolution. Dynamic resolution is a key for many games being able to maintain a stable frames per second. And because of that, I'm going to assume that Valve knows this and made sure that the games that were running on the system are able to support dynamic resolution. Maybe I'm wrong about that. Let's talk about those frames per second. In a recent IGN interview, one of the developers who was working on the Valve Steam Deck said this. They said, that they were targeting 800p 30 frames per second. And the internet, of course, lost its mind because that is what the internet does. What they didn't understand is that he didn't have quite the context in his answer. And so he later backed this up with a tweet that we can now refer to. Here's what he said. The 30 frames per second target refers to the floor of what we consider playable in our performance testing. Games we've tested and shown have consistently met and exceeded that bar so far. There will also be an optional built-in FPS limiter to fine-tune performance versus battery life. Okay, now I know that a lot of people who are members of the PC gaming community, they will often say, if it's not 60 frames per second, I am not playing it. And while I do understand that mentality, I think it's incredibly flawed. I think that it depends on the kind of game that you're playing. Playing the latest turn-based JRPG at 60 frames per second and 30 frames per second is essentially the same. Yeah, you might say I can see more frames, but it doesn't affect gameplay in any meaningful way, so it doesn't really matter. Playing a third-person action combat game at 60 frames per second versus 30 frames per second matters more than the turn-based JRPG, but I gotta be honest, I played Hyrule Warriors on my Nintendo Switch. That game sometimes dipped down to like 15 frames per second. Did I notice it? Yes. Did it impact my gameplay? No, not really. It all depends on the kind of game that you're playing. If you're playing a hardcore first-person shooter, maybe even a competitive shooter, that's where the 60 frames per second is key. And while I totally understand why somebody would absolutely want to play a competitive first-person shooter at 60 frames per second or even higher, playing at 30 frames per second is also okay as long as it's stable. What people fail to understand far more often than not is that a stable frame rate, a stable lower frame rate, is better than an unstable higher frame rate. And so as long as Valve is saying, look, we've got our floor, a game is playable at 30 frames per second. And then, you know, this guy, Pierre-Luc Griffay, I don't know how to say his name. I'm sorry, Pierre-Luc. He said that their testing, games they've tested, had met and exceeded that bar so far. So are you going to be able to run Red Dead Redemption 2 or Cyberpunk 2077 at 60 frames per second? Probably not. But it's not going to be the 15 frames per second that you're expecting, because you have to remember that the resolution is only 720p, which is 8 times lower than gaming at 4K. So most of the time, I say that the resolution doesn't matter, but in this case, it absolutely does, because it gets us a whole lot more performance because they're not targeting all those pixels. By the way, another reason that a lot of people seem excited for the Steam Deck is for playing retro games on the Steam Deck, which is absolutely something to be excited about. In fact, we have a video on this channel coming up very, very soon about that particular thing. All right, thanks for watching, everybody. I will see you all next time. Until then, I hope you stay awesome. Bye-bye.